Hi everyone, it's Miss Sheehan, and I wanted to do just a brief lecture on the Mexican-American War. Okay, so first think about these two definitions. What does the word ceded mean, or cede with a C, and what does the word annexed mean? So ceded means to give up, right? Like I ceded control to the driver of the car, right? I gave control over to the driver of the car. Annexed means to add or take, right? So I annexed that sweatshirt from my boyfriend, right? I took that sweatshirt, right? Or Canada annexed Alaska from America if they did, right? So those two words are going to be important for us in this lecture. Okay, so first we need to start back in 1819. So this is right after the Louisiana Purchase. Spain and the US sign what's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, where basically they agree to, like, Spain agrees to give up some land to the United States. And essentially the US gets Florida. So as you can see here, the US has these states here along the East Coast and into the Midwest and the South. Now it has the Louisiana Purchase Territory, which at the time was called the Missouri Territory. And now it has the Florida area as well. So basically, what we are missing is still this big chunk of what would later become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, right? And that was all owned by Mexico, who at the time was controlled by Spain, right? So this was actually called the Viceroyalty of New Spain at the time. And this Spanish treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty, actually sets the boundary of the U.S.-Mexico border. And you can see actually the Louisiana Purchase Territory goes across this boundary. And they kind of chose to ignore that, right? So you can see the boundary starts here at the Mississippi and then goes over here across the Arkansas, and then at latitude 42 ends there at what's now the border with Oregon, between California and Oregon. Right? So already there was a contest over this territory here in what would later become Texas. Okay, in 1821, Mexico gains its independence from Spain, and the Spanish Empire had been collapsing for the last essentially 100 years. And at this point, Mexico becomes its own independent country. And they still expect that the US would uphold the US-Mexican border that had been set with this Adams-Onis Treaty. In 1823, Mexico begins to offer cheap land in what would later become Texas, they called it Tejas, to attract American immigrants. Basically, they were saying, hey, people who want to come west, why don't you come settle on our territory? Because they had a lot of territory that was not settled by Mexican people, right? That area, especially in Texas, was fairly empty at the time, and they obviously want to grow their country. So the only two things you had to do to be eligible for this territory was to be Catholic, and then you also had to swear allegiance to the Mexican government, which basically means you would give up your US citizenship. But in return, they were giving you really cheap land, right? So that was a draw for many families. Okay, so in 1824, Americans begin to settle in Tejas, Texas, and they travel to what would later become cities in Texas on what was called the Santa Fe Trail. So it's kind of similar to the Oregon Trail. And things go well for about 10 years. However, 1835 rolls around and Mexico bans slavery. Remember, America doesn't ban slavery for another 30 years until the end of the Civil War, right? So Americans were used to basically being able to own and access slave labor. So the American settlers who had settled in this Tejas territory now are upset. They basically say, we didn't agree to this. We don't want to get rid of our slaves. And they actually declare independence from Mexico in protest. And essentially they declare they're their own country. They're this new country of Texas, right? And that's why Texas is often calls itself the Texas Republic, because for a brief time it was its independent country. However, Mexico never recognized Texas's independence. Basically, the settlers declared independence and Mexico said, la la la, we can't hear you, right? We're not going to recognize that you're independent. We're still going to consider you Mexicans. Okay, so putting that to one side, back in America, Americans in general during this period, and this is something we'll talk about in our next unit a lot, are divided because of two issues. One, they're worried that if Texas comes into the Union, into the United States, it's going to come in as a slave state, right? And they're also worried that this could lead to war with Mexico. If Mexico is not recognizing Texas's independence and Texas joins the United States, that would obviously lead to war. Right? And in fact, the Mexican leader, Santa Anna, warned that an annexation of Texas, if Texas joined the United States, would be, quote, equivalent to a declaration of war against the Mexican Republic. So the Mexicans saw this absolutely as a provocation, right? So America was a little hesitant to have Texas join the Union as it was asking. So, resolution to this, in 1845, the outgoing president, Tyler, who's right here, he signs a resolution to annex Texas. Basically, he says, okay, the US is going to accept, or it's going to take Texas from Mexico, and Texas is going to become the next state for the United States. And Polk, the next president, who was a very strong supporter of expansion, is obviously happy to take over this, and he takes over this as president. And on June 16th, 1845, Texas, or the people who represent themselves as the Republic of Texas, vote to join the United States. Remember all the while that Mexico is still not recognizing that Texas is an independent territory from Mexico, even though the people, many of the white Americans who lived there, thought of themselves that way. And Congress approves the annexation. So, think about to yourself, how do you think Mexico is going to respond to this? So this is essentially what the map of, it's cut off there, what the map of the US looks like at the end of 1845, right? All these states here, the Republic of Texas, this disputed area between Mexico and Texas, and then Mexico and all this unorganized territory up here, right? So, July of 1845, President Polk orders General Zachary Taylor, another of our famous generals who would later become president, to Texas. And essentially, that sets off the Mexican-American War. On May 13th, 1846, Congress declares war, despite opposition from some northern lawmakers who were hesitant to get the US into another war, right? However, no official declaration of war ever came from Mexico, because essentially that would be admitting that Texas had seceded away from Mexico. So they never actually officially declared war. So it's kind of pretty one-sided. And it's one-sided militarily too. The US marches to Mexico City easily. Mexico is extremely outnumbered and has inferior weaponry. Remember, Mexico had just been struggling for the last 20 years to establish their country after their independence from Spain, who had ruled Mexico for the last 400 years, essentially. So Mexico itself was a pretty young country, and it is now dominated by the United States. So on February 2nd of 1848, so just about a year and a half after the official start of the war, at least on the US side, the US and Mexico signed what's called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that basically establishes the Rio Grande River down at the bottom there of Texas. That becomes the US-Mexican border, and it remains that border, right? Down at the bottom. Mexico recognizes the US annexation of Texas, so Texas officially enters the Union. And then, in addition to Texas, Mexico sells California and the rest of its territory north of the Rio Grande, so what would become Arizona, California, Utah, to the US for $15 million. Which seems like a lot, but when you think about how much territory that is, and especially how many resources we got out of California, it is not that much money, right? So not only does the US gain Texas, but the US also gains territory that would become some of its major and most populated and most profitable states out of this treaty. So this was an overall big win for US expansion. So here we can see the map of the US in 1830, right? And then by 1853, we have expanded to what are now remain our borders, right? The only additions that come after really 1853 include Hawaii, Alaska, and then some of our territories, Puerto Rico and Guam, etc. Right? But really at this point, we have the continental boundaries that we still have today. So you can see the Mexican-American War is a huge and important step for the United States in achieving this manifest destiny coast-to-coast dream. And also, it was a big loss for Mexico, right? That's like what, almost half of the territory that they had was gone to the United States. Okay, that's it. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Bye.